Today we're going to read the Wikipedia article on Canada. Canada is a country located in the northern part of North America. Its 10 provinces and 3 territories extend from the Atlantic to the Pacific and northward into the Arctic Ocean, covering 9.98 million square kilometres or 3.85 million square miles, making it the world's second largest country by total area. Canada's southern border with the United States is the world's longest binational land border. Its capital is Ottawa, and its 3 largest metropolitan areas are Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. As a whole, Canada is sparsely populated, the majority of its land area being dominated by forests and tundra. Consequently, its population is highly urbanized, with over 80% of its inhabitants concentrated in large and medium-sized cities, many near the southern border. Canada's climate varies widely across its vast area, ranging from Arctic weather in the north to hot summers in the southern regions, with 4 distinct seasons. Various Indigenous peoples have inhabited what is now Canada for thousands of years prior to European colonisation. Beginning in the 16th century, British and French expeditions explored and later settled along the Atlantic coast. As a consequence of various armed conflicts, France ceded nearly all of its colonies in North America in 1763. In 1867, with the union of 3 British North American colonies through the Confederation, Canada was formed as a federal dominion of 4 provinces. This began an accretion of provinces and territories and a process of increasing autonomy from the United Kingdom. This widening autonomy was highlighted by the Statute of Westminster of 1931 and culminated in the Canada Act of 1982, which severed the last vestiges of legal dependence on the British Parliament, except for the power to amend its constitution. Canada is a federal parliamentary democracy and a constitutional monarchy, with Queen Elizabeth II being the head of state. The country is a realm within the Commonwealth of Nations, a member of the Francophonie, and officially bilingual at the federal level. It ranks among the highest in international measurements of government transparency, civil liberties, quality of life, economic freedom, and education. It is one of the world's most ethnically diverse and multicultural nations, the product of large-scale immigration from many other countries. Canada's long and complex relationship with the United States has had a significant impact on its economy and culture. Canada is a developed country and has the 15th highest nominal per capita income globally, as well as the 10th highest ranking in the Human Development Index. Its advanced economy is the 10th largest in the world, relying chiefly upon its abundant natural resources and well-developed international trade networks. Canada is part of several major international and intergovernmental institutions or groupings, including the United Nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the G7, the Group of 10, the G20, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. Etymology. While a variety of theories have been postulated for the etymological origins of Canada, the name is now accepted as coming from the St. Lawrence Iroquoian word Kanata, meaning village or settlement. In 1535, indigenous inhabitants of the present-day Quebec City region used the word to direct French explorer Jacques Cartier to the village of Stadacona. Cartier later used the word Canada to refer not only to that particular village, but to the entire area subject to Donnacona, the chief at Stadacona. By 1545, European books and maps had begun referring to this small region along the St. Lawrence River as Canada. From the 16th to the early 18th century, Canada referred to the part of New France that lay along the St. Lawrence River. In 1791, the area became 2 British colonies called Upper Canada and Lower Canada, collectively named the Canadas, until their union as the British province of Canada in 1841. Upon Confederation in 1867, Canada was adopted as a legal name for the new country at the London Conference, and the word Dominion was conferred as the country's title. The transition away from the use of Dominion was formally reflected in 1982 with the passage of the Canada Act, which refers only to Canada. Later that year, the name of the National Day was changed from Dominion Day to Canada Day. The term Dominion is also used to distinguish the federal government from the provinces, though after the Second World War the term federal had replaced Dominion. History. Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples in present-day Canada include the First Nations, Inuit and Métis, the last being a mixed-blood people who originated in the mid-17th century when First Nations and Inuit people married European settlers. The term Aboriginal, as a collective noun, is a specific term of art used in some legal documents, including the Constitution Act of 1982. The first inhabitants of North America are generally hypothesized to have migrated from Siberia by way of the Bering Land Bridge and arrived at least 14,000 years ago. The Paleo-Indian archaeological sites at Old Crow Flats and Bluefish Caves are two of the oldest sites of human habitation in Canada. The characteristics of Canadian Indigenous societies included permanent settlements, agriculture, complex social hierarchies and trading networks. Some of these cultures had collapsed by the time European explorers arrived in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, and have only been discovered through archaeological investigations. The indigenous population at the time of the first European settlements is estimated to have been between 200,000 and 2 million, with a figure of 500,000 accepted by Canada's Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. As a consequence of European colonisation, the population of Canada's Indigenous peoples declined by 40 to 80%, and several First Nations, such as Beothuk, disappeared. The decline is attributed to several causes, including the transfer of European diseases such as influenza, measles and smallpox, to which they had no natural immunity. Conflicts over the fur trade, conflicts with the colonial authorities and settlers, and the loss of indigenous lands to settlers, and the subsequent collapse of several nations' self-sufficiency. Although not without conflict, European Canadians' early interactions with First Nations and Inuit populations were relatively peaceful. First Nations and Métis people played a critical part in the development of European colonies in Canada, particularly for their role in assisting European coureurs de bois and voyageurs in the exploration of the continent during the North American fur trade. The Crown and Indigenous peoples began interactions during the European colonisation period, though the Inuit in general had more limited interaction with European settlers. However, from the late 18th century, European Canadians encouraged Indigenous peoples to assimilate into their own culture. These attempts reached a climax in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with forced integration and relocations. A period of redress is underway, which started with the appointment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada by the Government of Canada in 2008. European colonisation. The first known attempt at European colonisation began when Norsemen settled briefly at Lans-Ormedo in Newfoundland around 1000 AD. No further European exploration occurred until 1497, when the Italian seafarer John Cabot explored and claimed Canada's Atlantic coast in the name of King Henry VII of England. Then Basque and Portuguese mariners established seasonal whaling and fishing outposts along the Atlantic coast in the early 16th century. In 1534, the French explorer Jacques Cartier explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where, on July the 24th, he planted a 10-metre or 33 feet high cross bearing the words, "Long live the King of France," and took possession of the territory New France in the name of King Francis I. In general, the settlements appear to have been short-lived, possibly due to the similarity of outputs producible in Scandinavia and northern Canada and the problems of navigating trade routes at that time. In 1583, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, by the royal prerogative of Queen Elizabeth I, founded St John's, Newfoundland, as the first North American English colony. The French explorer Samuel de Champlain arrived in 1603 and established the first permanent European settlements at Port Royal in 1605 and Quebec City in 1608. Among the colonists of New France, Canadians extensively settled the St. Lawrence River Valley and Acadians settled the present-day Maritimes, while fur traders and Catholic missionaries explored the Great Lakes, Hudson Bay, and the Mississippi watershed to Louisiana. The Beaver Wars broke out in the mid-17th century over control of the North American fur trade. The English established additional settlements in Newfoundland beginning in 1610, and the 13 colonies to the south were founded soon after. A series of 4 wars erupted in colonial North America between 1689 and 1763. The later wars of the period constituted the North American theatre of the 7 Years' War. Mainland Nova Scotia came under British rule with the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, and Canada and most of New France came under British rule in 1763 after the 7 Years' War. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 established First Nation treaty rights, created the province of Quebec out of New France, and annexed Cape Breton Island to Nova Scotia. St. John's Island, now Prince Edward Island, became a separate colony in 1769. To avert conflict in Quebec, the British Parliament passed the Quebec Act of 1774, expanding Quebec's territory to the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. More importantly, the Quebec Act afforded Quebec special autonomy and rights of self-administration at a time that the 13 colonies were increasingly agitating against British rule. It re-established the French language, Catholic faith, and French civil law there, staving off the growth of an independence movement in contrast to the 13 colonies. The proclamation and the Quebec Act in turn angered many residents of the 13 colonies, further fueling anti-British settlement in the years prior to the American Revolution. After the successful American War of Independence, the 1783 Treaty of Paris recognised the independence of the newly formed United States and set the terms of peace, ceding British North American territories south of the Great Lakes to the new country. The American War of Independence also caused a large outmigration of Loyalists, the settlers who had fought against American independence. Many moved to Canada, particularly Atlantic Canada, where their arrival changed the demographic distribution of the existing territories. New Brunswick was in turn split from Nova Scotia as part of a reorganisation of Loyalist settlements in the Maritimes, which led to the incorporation of St John, New Brunswick, to become Canada's first city. To accommodate the influx of English-speaking Loyalists in central Canada, the Constitutional Act of 1791 divided the province of Canada into the French-speaking Lower Canada, later Quebec, and the English-speaking Upper Canada, later Ontario, granting each its own elected legislative assembly. The Canadas were the main front in the War of 1812 between the United States and the United Kingdom. Peace came in 1815. No boundaries were changed. Immigration resumed at a higher level, with over 960,000 arrivals from Britain between 1815 and 1850. New arrivals included refugees escaping the Great Irish Famine, as well as Gaelic-speaking Scots displaced by the Highland clearances. Infectious diseases killed between 25 and 33% of Europeans who immigrated to Canada before 1891. The desire for responsible government resulted in the abortive rebellions of 1837. The Durham Report subsequently recommended responsible government and the assimilation of French Canadians into English culture. The Act of Union merged the Canadas into a united province of Canada, and responsible government was established for all provinces of British North America by 1849. The signing of the Oregon Treaty by Britain and the United States in 1846 ended the Oregon boundary dispute, extending the border westward along the 49th parallel. This paved the way for British colonies on Vancouver Island and in British Columbia. In 1867, the same year as Canadian Confederation, Britain declined to purchase for Canada the Alaska Territory that was to that point tenuously held by Russia. With the United States purchasing Alaska instead, clearly demarcated borders for Canada, although there would continue to be some disputes about the exact demarcation of the Alaska-Yukon and Alaska-BC border for years to come. Confederation and expansion. Following several constitutional conferences, the Constitution Act officially proclaimed Canadian Confederation on July 1, 1867, initially with 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Canada assumed control of Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory to form the Northwest Territories, where the Métis grievances ignited the Red River Rebellion and the creation of the province of Manitoba in July 1870. British Columbia and Vancouver Island, which had been united in 1866, joined the Confederation in 1871, while Prince Edward Island joined in 1873. To open the West to European immigration, Parliament also approved sponsoring the construction of 3 transcontinental railroads, including the Canadian Pacific Railway, opening the prairies to settlement with the Dominion Lands Act, and establishing the Northwest Mounted Police to reassert its authority over this territory. In 1898, during the Klondike Gold Rush in the Northwest Territories, Parliament created the Yukon Territory. Alberta and Saskatchewan became provinces in 1905. Early 20th century. Because Britain still maintained control of Canada's foreign affairs under the Constitution Act of 1867, its declaration of war in 1914 automatically brought Canada into World War I. Volunteers sent to the Western Front later became part of the Canadian Corps, which played a substantial role in the Battle of Vimy Ridge and other major engagements of the war. Out of approximately 625,000 Canadians who served in World War I, some 60,000 were killed and another 172,000 were wounded. The conscription crisis of 1917 erupted when the Unionist Cabinet's proposal to augment the military's dwindling number of active members with conscription was met with vehement objections from French-speaking Quebecers. The Military Service Act brought in compulsory military service, though it, coupled with disputes over French language schools outside Quebec, deeply alienated Francophone Canadians and temporarily split the Liberal Party. In 1919, Canada joined the League of Nations independently of Britain, and the 1931 Statute of Westminster affirmed Canada's independence. The Great Depression in Canada during the early 1930s saw an economic downturn leading to hardship across the country. In response to the downturn, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, or the CCF, in Saskatchewan introduced many elements of a welfare state, as pioneered by Tommy Douglas in the 1940s and 1950s. On the advice of the Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, war with Germany was declared effective September 10, 1939, by King George VI, 7 days after the United Kingdom. The delay underscored Canada's independence. The first Canadian Army units arrived in Britain in December 1939. In all, over 1 million Canadians served in the armed forces during World War II, and approximately 42,000 were killed, and another 55,000 were wounded. Canadian troops played important roles in many key battles of the war, including the failed 1942 Dieppe raid, the Allied invasion of Italy, the Normandy landings, the Battle of Normandy, and the Battle of the Scheldt in 1944. Canada provided asylum for the Dutch monarchy while that country was occupied, and is credited by the Netherlands for major contributions to its liberation from Nazi Germany. The Canadian economy boomed during the war as its industries manufactured military material for Canada, Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. Despite another conscription crisis in Quebec in 1944, Canada finished the war with a large army and a strong economy. The contemporary era. The financial crisis of the Great Depression had led the Dominion of Newfoundland to relinquish responsible government in 1934 and become a Crown colony ruled by a British governor. After two bitter referendums, Newfoundlanders voted to join Canada in 1949 as a province. Canada's post-war economic growth, combined with the policies of successive Liberal governments, led to the emergence of a new Canadian identity, marked by the adoption of the maple leaf flag in 1965, the implementation of its official bilingualism, English and French, in 1969, and the institution of official multiculturalism in 1971. Socially democratic programs were also instituted, such as Medicare, the Canada Pension Plan, and Canada Student Loans, though provincial governments, particularly Quebec and Alberta, opposed many of these as incursions into their jurisdictions. Finally, another series of constitutional conferences resulted in the Canada Act, the patriation of Canada's constitution from the United Kingdom, concurrent with the creation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Canada had established complete sovereignty as an independent country, although the Queen retained her role as Monarch of Canada. In 1999, Nunavut became Canada's third territory after a series of negotiations with the federal government. At the same time, Quebec underwent profound social and economic changes through the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s, giving birth to a secular nationalist movement. The radical Front de Libération du Québec, or FLQ, ignited the October Crisis with a series of bombings and kidnappings in 1970. And the sovereigntist Parti Québécois was elected in 1976, organising an unsuccessful referendum on sovereignty association in 1980. Attempts to accommodate Quebec nationalism constitutionally through the Meech Lake Accord failed in 1990. This led to the formation of the Bloc Québécois in Quebec and the invigoration of the Reform Party of Canada in the West. A second referendum followed in 1995, in which sovereignty was rejected by a slimmer margin of 50.6 to 49.4%. In 1997, the Supreme Court ruled that unilateral succession by a province would be unconstitutional, and the Clarity Act was passed by Parliament, outlining the terms of a negotiated departure from the Confederation. In addition to the issues of Quebec sovereignty, a number of crises shook Canadian society in the late 1980s and early 1990s. These included the explosion of Air India Flight 182 in 1985, the largest mass murder in Canadian history, the École Polytechnique massacre in 1989, a university shooting targeting female students, and the Oka crisis of 1990, the first of a number of violent confrontations between the government and Indigenous groups. Canada also joined the Gulf War in 1990 as part of the US-led coalition force and was active in several peacekeeping missions in the 1990s, including the UN Profor mission in the former Yugoslavia. Canada sent troops to Afghanistan in 2001, but declined to join the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. In 2011, Canadian forces participated in the NATO-led intervention into the Libyan civil war, and also became involved in battling the Islamic State insurgency in Iraq in the mid-2010s. Geography and climate. Canada occupies much of the continent of North America, sharing land borders with the contiguous United States to the south and the US state of Alaska to the northwest. Canada stretches from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Pacific Ocean in the west, and to the north lies the Arctic Ocean. Greenland is to the northeast, and to the southeast Canada shares a maritime boundary with the Republic of France's overseas collectivity of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, the last vestige of New France. By total area, including its waters, Canada is the second largest country in the world after Russia. By land area alone, however, Canada ranks fourth, the difference being due to it having the world's largest proportion of freshwater lakes. Of Canada's 13 provinces and territories, only 2 are landlocked, Alberta and Saskatchewan, while the other 11 all directly border one of the 3 oceans. Canada is home to the world's northernmost settlement, Canadian Forces Station Alert, on the northern tip of Ellesmere Island, at latitude 82.5 degrees north, which lies 817 kilometres or 508 miles from the North Pole. Much of the Canadian Arctic is covered by ice and permafrost. Canada has the longest coastline in the world with a total length of 243,042 kilometres or 151,019 miles. Additionally, its border with the United States is the world's longest land border, stretching 8,891 kilometres, 5,525 miles. 3 of Canada's Arctic islands, Baffin Island, Victoria Island and Ellesmere Island, are among the 10 largest in the world. Since the end of the last glacial period, Canada has consisted of 8 distinct forest regions, including extensive boreal forest on the Canadian Shield. Canada has over 2 million lakes, 563 greater than 100 square kilometres or 39 square miles, which is more than any other country, containing much of the world's fresh water. There are also freshwater glaciers in the Canadian Rockies and the Coast Mountains. Canada is geologically active, having many earthquakes and potentially active volcanoes, notably Mount Meager Massif, Mount Garibaldi, Mount Cayley Massif, and the Mount Edziza volcanic complex. The volcanic eruption of the Cx cone in 1775 was among Canada's worst natural disasters, killing an estimated 2,000 Niskaha people and destroying their village in the Nass River Valley of northern British Columbia. The eruption produced a 22.5 kilometre or 14-mile lava flow and, according to Niskaha legend, blocked the flow of the Nass River. Average winter and summer high temperatures across Canada vary from region to region. Winters can be harsh in many parts of the country, particularly in the interior and prairie provinces, which experience a continental climate, where daily average temperatures are near minus 15 degrees centigrade, 5 degrees Fahrenheit, but can drop below minus 40 degrees centigrade or minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit with severe wind chills. In non-coastal regions, snow can cover the ground for almost 6 months of the year, while in parts of the north snow can persist year-round. Coastal British Columbia has a temperate climate with a mild and rainy winter. On the east and west coasts, average high temperatures are generally in the low 20s degrees Celsius or 70s degrees Fahrenheit, while between the coasts, the average summer high temperature ranges from 25 to 30 degrees Celsius, 77 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, with temperatures in some interior locations occasionally exceeding 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Government and politics. Canada is described as a full democracy with a tradition of liberalism and an egalitarian, moderate political ideology. An emphasis on social justice has been a distinguishing element of Canada's political culture. Peace, order and good government are founding principles of the Canadian government. Canada has been dominated by 2 relatively centrist political parties at the federal level: the centre-left Liberal Party of Canada and the centre-right Conservative Party of Canada, or its predecessors. The historically predominant Liberal Party positioned themselves at the centre of the Canadian political spectrum, with the Conservative Party positioned on the right and the New Democratic Party occupying the left. Far-right and far-left politics have never been a prominent force in Canadian society. 5 parties had representatives elected to the federal parliament in the 2015 election. The Liberal Party, who currently form the government, the Conservative Party, who are the official opposition, the New Democratic Party, the Bloc Québécois, and the Green Party of Canada. Canada has a parliamentary system within the context of a constitutional monarchy, the monarchy of Canada being the foundation of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The Canadian monarchy is a separate legal institution from the monarchy of the United Kingdom, though the 2 offices are held by the same individual. The sovereign is Queen Elizabeth II, who is also monarch of 15 other Commonwealth countries and each of Canada's 10 provinces. As such, the Queen's representative, the Governor-General of Canada, at present Julie Payette, carries out most of the federal royal duties in Canada. The direct participation of the royal and viceroyal figures in areas of governance is limited. In practice, their use of the executive powers is directed by the Cabinet, a committee of ministers of the Crown responsible to the elected House of Commons of Canada and chosen and headed by the Prime Minister of Canada, at present Justin Trudeau, the head of government. The Governor-General or monarch may, though in certain crisis situations, exercise their power without ministerial advice. To ensure the stability of government, the Governor-General will usually appoint as Prime Minister the person who is the current leader of the political party that can obtain the confidence of a plurality in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister's Office, or PMO, is thus one of the most powerful institutions in government, initiating most legislation for parliamentary approval and selecting for appointment by the Crown, besides the aforementioned the Governor-General, Lieutenant Governors, Senators, Federal Court judges, and heads of Crown corporations and government agencies. The leader of the party with the second most seats usually becomes the leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition and is part of an adversarial parliamentary system intended to keep the government in check. Each of the 338 members of Parliament in the House of Commons is elected by simple plurality in an electoral riding or district. General elections must be called by the Governor-General either on the advice of the Prime Minister or if the government loses a confidence vote in the House. Constitutionally, an election may be held no more than 5 years after the preceding election, although the Canada Elections Act limits this to 4 years with a fixed election date in October. The 105 members of the Senate, whose seats are apportioned on a regional basis, serve until the age of 75. Canada's federal structure divides government responsibilities between the federal government and the 10 provinces. Provincial legislatures are unicameral and operate in parliamentary fashion, similar to the House of Commons. Canada's 3 territories also have legislatures, but these are not sovereign and have fewer constitutional responsibilities than the provinces. The territorial legislatures also differ structurally from their provincial counterparts. The Bank of Canada is the central bank of the country. In addition, the Minister of Finance and Minister of Industry utilise the Statistics Canada Agency for financial planning and economic policy development. The Bank of Canada is the sole authority authorised to issue currency in the form of Canadian banknotes. The bank does not issue Canadian coins. They are issued by the Royal Canadian Mint. Law. The Constitution of Canada is the supreme law of the country and consists of written text and unwritten conventions. The Constitution Act 1867, known as the British North America Act prior to 1982, affirmed governance based on parliamentary precedent and divided powers between the federal and provincial governments. The Statute of Westminster of 1931 granted full autonomy, and the Constitution Act of 1982 ended all legislative ties to the United Kingdom, as well as adding a constitutional amending formula and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter guarantees basic rights and freedoms that usually cannot be overridden by any government, though a notwithstanding clause allows the federal parliament and provincial legislatures to override certain sections of the Charter for a period of 5 years. The Indian Act, various treaties and case laws were established to mediate most relations between Europeans and native peoples. Most notably, a series of 11 treaties, known as the Numbered Treaties, were signed between the Indigenous and the reigning monarch of Canada between 1871 and 1921. These treaties are written with the Canadian Crown and Council, administered by the Canadian Aboriginal Law and overseen by the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Development. The role of the treaties and the rights they support were reaffirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. These rights may include the provision of services such as health care and exemption from taxation. The legal and policy framework within which Canada and First Nations operate was further formalised in 2005 through the First Nations Federal Crown Political Accord. Canada's judiciary plays an important role in interpreting laws and has the power to strike down acts of Parliament that violate the Constitution. The Supreme Court of Canada is the highest court and final arbiter and has been led since December 18th, 2017 by Chief Justice Richard Wagner. Its 9 members are appointed by the Governor-General on the advice of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice. All judges at the superior and appellate levels are appointed after consultation with non-governmental bodies. The Federal Cabinet also appoints justices to superior courts in the provincial and territorial jurisdictions. Common law prevails everywhere except in Quebec, where civil law predominates. Criminal law is solely a federal responsibility and is uniform throughout Canada. Law enforcement, including criminal courts, is officially a provincial responsibility conducted by provincial and municipal police forces. However, in most rural areas and some urban areas, policing responsibilities are contracted to the Federal Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Foreign relations and military. Canada is recognised as a middle power for its role in international affairs with a tendency to pursue multilateral solutions. Canada's foreign policy, based on international peacekeeping and security, is carried out through coalitions and international organisations and through the work of numerous federal institutions. Canada's peacekeeping role during the 20th century has played a major role in its global image. The strategy of the Canadian government's foreign aid policy reflects an emphasis to meet the Millennium Development Goals, while also providing assistance in response to foreign humanitarian crises. Canada was a founding member of the United Nations and has had membership in the World Trade Organization, the G20, and the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. Canada is also a member of various other international and regional organisations and forums for economic and cultural affairs. Canada acceded to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 1976. Canada joined the Organisation of American States of the OAS in 1990 and hosted the OAS General Assembly in 2000 and the Third Summit of the Americas in 2001. Canada seeks to expand its ties to the Pacific Rim economies through membership of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, APEC. Canada and the United States share the world's longest undefended border, cooperate on military campaigns and exercises, and are each other's largest trading partner. Canada nevertheless has an independent foreign policy, most notably maintaining full relations with Cuba and declining to officially participate in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Canada also maintains historic ties to the United Kingdom and France, and to other former British and French colonies through Canada's membership in the Commonwealth of Nations and the Francophonie. Canada is noted for having a positive relationship with the Netherlands, owing in part to its contribution to the Dutch liberation during World War II. Canada's strong attachment to the British Empire and Commonwealth led to major participation in British military efforts in the Second Boer War, World War I and World War II. Since then, Canada has been an advocate for multilateralism, making efforts to resolve global issues in collaboration with other nations. During the Cold War, Canada was a major contributor to UN forces in the Korean War and founded the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, in cooperation with the United States to defend against potential aerial attacks from the Soviet Union. During the Suez Crisis of 1956, the future Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson eased tensions by proposing the inception of the United Nations Peacekeeping Force, for which he was awarded the 1957 Nobel Peace Prize. As this was the first UN peacekeeping mission, Pearson is often credited as the inventor of the concept. Canada has since served in over 50 peacekeeping missions, including every UN peacekeeping effort until 1989, and has since maintained forces in international missions in Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, and elsewhere. Canada has sometimes faced controversy over its involvement in foreign countries, notably in the 1993 Somalia affair. In 2001, Canada deployed troops to Afghanistan as part of the US Stabilisation Force and the UN-authorised NATO-led International Security Assistance Force. In February 2007, Canada, Italy, the United Kingdom, Norway and Russia announced their joint commitment to a $1.5 billion project to help develop vaccines for developing nations and called on other countries to join them. In August 2007, Canada's territorial claims in the Arctic were challenged after a Russian underwater expedition to the North Pole. Canada has considered that area to be sovereign territory since 1925. The nation employs a professional, volunteer military force of approximately 79,000 active personnel and 32,250 reserve personnel. The Unified Canadian Forces comprise the Canadian Army, the Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force. In 2013, Canada's military expenditure totaled approximately 19 billion Canadian dollars, or around 1% of the country's GDP. Following the 2016 Defence Policy Review, the Canadian government announced a 70% increase to the country's defence budget over the next decade. The Canadian Forces will acquire 88 fighter planes and 15 naval surface combatants, the latter as part of the National Shipbuilding Procurement Strategy. Canada's total military expenditure is expected to reach 32.7 billion Canadian dollars by 2027. Provinces and territories. Canada is a federation composed of 10 provinces and 3 territories. In turn, these may be grouped into 4 main regions: Western Canada, Central Canada, Atlantic Canada, and Northern Canada. Eastern Canada refers to Central Canada, Atlantic Canada together. Provinces have more autonomy than the territories, having responsibility for social programs such as healthcare, education, and welfare. Together, the provinces collect more revenue than the federal government, an almost unique structure among federations in the world. Using its spending powers, the federal government can initiate national policies in provincial areas, such as the Canada Health Act. The provinces can opt out of these, but rarely do so in practice. Equalisation payments are made by the federal government to ensure that reasonably uniform standards of services and taxation are kept between the richer and poorer provinces. The major difference between a Canadian province and a territory is that provinces receive their power and authority from the Constitution Act 1867, which was formerly called the British North America Act of 1867. Whereas territorial governments have powers delegated to them by the Parliament of Canada. The powers flowing from the Constitution Act are divided between the Government of Canada, the federal government, and the provincial governments to exercise exclusively. A change to the division of powers between the federal government and the provinces requires a constitutional amendment, whereas a similar change affecting the territories can be performed unilaterally by the Parliament of Canada or the government.